Augustine, John Chrysostom. They come from what is now considered to be the Islamic world. They come from the Middle East and North Africa. These lands were conquered, the Christians were subjugated, they were subjected to such discriminatory practices that the only thing that they could do to gain a decent life, to be able to live a life with some measure of dignity, was to convert to Islam. And then suddenly all this discrimination would cease, the taxes would go away. You know that's a good incentive. A lot of people converted. It took many hundreds of years, but ultimately lands that had been 99% Christian are now today 99% Muslim and considered to be the heart of the Islamic world. This began in the 630s. By 1095, when the First Crusade was called by Pope Urban, they had conquered a huge expanse of land stretching from Spain all the way across North Africa, up into Eastern Europe, and all the way across to India. And it was all in line with this imperative and this idea, this understanding that the non-Muslims did not enjoy any right to rule or any right to live in peace and harmony as equals with the Muslims. Now, the Crusades then made some attempt, a small attempt for 200 years, between 1095 and 1291, to stop that. But not even really to stop that directly. That was just an indirect effect of it. But to protect Christians in the Holy Land. And there were small Christian principalities set up in the Holy Land for this purpose. Certainly the Crusaders were not sinless. No one is. Certainly the Crusaders did some things that cannot be excused. That's absolutely true. But the idea that the Western world bears the historical guilt for provoking the Islamic world in this way is absolutely historically false. The Crusades ultimately failed, but they did stop the Islamic advance into Europe, the Jihad advance into Europe, for those 200 years, which may have made the difference between a completely conquered and Islamized Europe and a Europe that became the repository and the birthplace for Western civilization. So, in the scheme of the Islamic scheme, the Islamic understanding of mankind, man is the slave of Allah. You are only entitled to paradise if you are a Muslim, and if you, the only guarantee of paradise is to those who slay and are slain for Allah, those who fight in these wars that are sanctioned by the Islamic religion, and those who prevail in them or are killed. And if you're killed, then there's the promise. Chapter 9, verse 111 of the Quran promises paradise to those who kill and are killed for Allah, which is the rationale behind suicide bombing today. Now, this is not an idea, obviously, of free people. This is not a vision that is conducive to freedom. In the Christian scheme of things, however, freedom is absolutely fundamental. The Islamic world criticizes the West today for being libertine, for allowing things like blasphemy, like Salman Rushdie, for even rewarding the blasphemer by knighting him. This comes from the idea that is rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition that you cannot properly love and serve God unless you are free to do so. If you were not free, if you were a slave, if you have to do what he says because you are forced, and if you don't, then you get you are subjugated or condemned to hell, or both. On the other hand, you have this Christian idea that you are only properly serving God if you are free not to do so. But if you are free not to do so, you have to be genuinely free not to do so. And that means that some people will be evil. Some people will choose evil. We do not accept the evil. We do not agree with the evil. We do not approve of the evil. But as the Lord Jesus in the New Testament says, you allow the tares to grow with the wheat until the end of the world. They grow together because if you uproot the one, then you risk uprooting the other. Now, this means that freedom is essential. The freedom to be evil is essential to the ability to be good. The freedom to do right, the ability to do right, the ability to choose what is good, absolutely requires the ability to choose what is evil or it's hollow. Now, this is a fundamentally different idea from the idea that you enforce these things through threats and fear and punishment. But this is the idea in Islamic law. So in Islamic law, you have the idea that if the thief is caught, you amputate the hand of the thief. The adulterers are stoned to death. The fundamental difference, I think, is summed up there, and that's where I will end up and take some questions. In the Gospels, in John chapter 7:53, starting there and going to 8:11, Jesus is confronted by some of the Pharisees, and they have this woman who's been caught in adultery. And he tells them, of course, let the one of you who is without sin throw the first stone at her. Because after all, the law says she should be stoned. There's a parallel story. Muhammad is approached by a woman who confesses to him that she committed adultery. And he says, okay, go away and find out if you are pregnant or not. So she does. And she comes back a little while later, a few weeks later, and says, I am pregnant. And he says, okay, go away till the child's born. And so she comes back when the child's born and says, here, the child's born. Okay, go away until the child's weaned. So she comes back when the child's weaned, and he orders her stoned to death, and she is duly stoned to death. And this is held up as an example of how wise and merciful he is, because he allowed the child to be born before enforcing the law. Now, you see the key difference between those things. We may not like what the woman did in either story. We may not approve of it, but to be merciful to her is not to approve of what she did. Now, that's the same principle here. I don't know if I'm articulating this very well today, but Salman Rushdie is not a very likable character. And we may not like blasphemy at all. But ultimately, having Salman Rushdies in the world, if not knighting them, is the price to pay for a society in which it is possible to develop genuine virtue and to be genuinely good, rather than to only be submitting to coercion, as is mandated by Islamic law. This was the struggle that engulfed the Middle East during the Crusades. This was the struggle that Europe has been fighting for centuries, fighting off the Islamic warriors who are intending to bring this coercive system, this coercive society, and impose it upon them. That, of course, is again a challenge in Europe, and it's very likely that we're going to see it play out with increasing bloodshed over the next few decades, since Europe, with incredible short-sightedness, has been allowing Muslim immigration in huge numbers without any kind of screening or questioning or consideration at all of the possibility that the Muslims who are coming into Europe may want to remake society into the image of Islamic society. Yet, of course, that is, since Islam is and always has been a political and social system as well as an individual religious faith, that is something that should have been considered, something that could have been considered had the Europeans been mindful of the history, notably the history of the Crusades and what provoked them, and of the teachings of the Islamic faith. Now, one final word. It is often said that if you speak about the fact that Islamic law is coercive and that it requires the subjugation of non-Muslims and that it teaches warfare against unbelievers, people will often say, well, you can't say that. You must hate them if you say that. And, you know, that's really, I mean, people say this to me all the time, but I still can't get over it. It's the silliest thing I've ever heard. And when people say it to you, you should respond accordingly. That what Islam teaches and what Islam has done is a matter of fact. These things are verifiable. You can read the Quran, and I encourage you to do so, and see what